Hello, and welcome to the first video on my How to Install Linux series. Let's go over our learning outcomes first. The first thing you're going to learn is some basic terms and vocabulary. Then you're going to learn which version of Linux should you be using and how do you acquire that version. Then we're going to talk about burning those files onto a flash drive. And finally, the last step is individual guides on how to install these different operating systems and how to get some of your favorite software up and running right away. The first term that we should talk about is a distro, or a distribution. Really, it's just a version of Linux. It's basically a term like operating system. Just like macOS and Windows are an operating system, distro is just the same thing, right? There are different distros, different flavors of Linux, but basically just think of each individual distro as its own operating system. Another thing you'll need to understand is package managers. They're a big determining factor in what makes a distro unique. They're both graphical package managers and ones that are done in the command line or terminal. You can kind of think of them like the App Store on iPhone or the Play Store on Android. They both have access to the same apps, with a few exceptions, and it gives you peace of mind of not having to download programs from potentially untrustworthy sites, because all apps in your package manager have been validated to work on your operating system and are from trustworthy sources. Next key piece of vocabulary that you need to know is a desktop environment. It's more or less what it sounds like. It is how your desktop should look. Desktop environments, or DEs for short, also usually come with some preset packaged software. Typically, this will be software you associate with basic tasks on Windows or Mac OS 2. It'll be things like a text editor, a video player, a settings app, a word processor maybe, or something to do spreadsheets in, that kind of software. To go along with our idea and kind of show you more what I mean when I talk about desktop environments, this would be a desktop environment in Windows. Right? We have our taskbar at the bottom with some of our commonly used apps. This is what happens when someone presses the Windows key or clicks on the Windows icon. They see a few more of their apps, they have their desktop background, and a little information about their system in the bottom right in the system tray. Similarly, this is a desktop environment for macOS. Specifically, I believe this is macOS Monterey. They have their system preferences in a bar along the top, along with like time and battery. They also have a dock at the bottom that holds their commonly used applications, their file explorer, and their trash bin. We'll talk more about specific Linux desktop environments later, but this is an example of one. This one is called KDE Plasma, and it's very Windows-like, so you can get a very similar experience to Windows, if you're used to that, on Linux. Similarly, GNOME Shell, although to be fair, this is just someone looking at the applications tab of GNOME. GNOME has a dock, so it might feel more familiar to someone who's used to using macOS. It also has a bar at the top of the screen, which again, may feel familiar to macOS users. In section 2, we're going to talk about Linux distributions and which ones you should be using. If you Google best Linux distro, you'll be met with a truly endless list of choices. However, most of these choices are actually just choices that are based on other distributions, and they come with the exact same desktop environments in most cases. For that reason, there are really only 3 choices that most people should be considering: Debian, Arch, and Fedora. The first one of these distributions I would like to talk about is Debian. Debian is what most Linux users' desktops either are running or are based on. Because of this, there's a lot of documentation online. If you Google, why is this not working, or how do I install this, or guide for that, chances are there's a guide for Debian if there's a guide for nothing else, even if there's not a guide for Windows. And a lot of guides that you'll find for Linux, whether you're Googling for a problem or you're just trying to learn something, will assume that you're running Debian or one of its derivatives, because that's what most people run. Because of that, there'll be a lot of guides that assume that you're using apt, which is the package manager for Debian, or that your file structure is set up in the way that Debian would set up a file structure. While this can be a downside for some other distributions, it's definitely a bonus of Debian, as well as Debian being extremely stable and allowing you to choose which desktop environment you want out of a few choices during the installation process. So you don't have to download a specific desktop edition with, KDE like we looked at earlier. It's just in the normal Debian installer, which is amazing. One of the biggest downsides of Debian, however, is its packages are a little bit older. Now, this does make them very stable, and they're usually great to work with. However, if you have, bleeding edge hardware, or if you're looking for kind of like the latest software features, you want to really be in on the ground floor of things, Debian might not be the operating system for you. The next in the list of operating systems that I recommended was Arch Linux. However, Arch Linux is not really for beginners. There's a lot of know-how that goes into Arch. I would say that for most people, their first time even installing Arch is going to take them about 30 or 40 minutes, and that's on the short side. This is because when you go to install Arch, it doesn't have a graphical installer the way that most other distributions do, and the way that Windows and Mac OS does. Arch installation is exclusively through the command line, and you don't have any kind of desktop environment unless you specifically add it. However, with that being said, there are a few derivatives of Arch Linux that do have graphical installers and that are much easier to use for beginners. One of the ones that I like is EndeavourOS. I like EndeavourOS because it still has really up-to-date Arch packages. It still allows you to use the Arch user repository, which is a repository, basically exactly how it sounds. It's software that users have validated or that they've built, that they've uploaded for other Arch users to download. EndeavourOS also, just like Debian, allows you to choose your desktop environment that you would like during the installation process. And what's even better about Endeavor's installer is that when you click on one of the names of the desktop environments that you would like, it shows you a preview of what it looks like and how that desktop environment could look on your system and how it could run. Being based on Arch, EndeavourOS does have some extremely powerful tools. The first of which I would like to talk about is that first page we saw, the Arch Wiki. The Arch Wiki has information about Linux that nowhere else has. It is really the most kind of definitive resource on Linux in general, especially if you're running an Arch derivative, but even if you're running Debian or Fedora or OpenSUSE, there are things that you can learn from the Arch Linux wiki that you really can't learn anywhere else, and that are super well laid out. The wiki is divided, as you can see here, into distribution, community, wiki interaction, but there's also just a ton of random, bugs and forums and patches and things that have been figured out by people over the last decade to make Linux better and to show you kind of how Linux works. How does the files work? How does when you want to change a desktop environment, say you start with a certain desktop environment and you think, I don't really care for this, and you want to change it, how do you change it? You can learn how to do that for all Linux distributions through the Arch Wiki. It's an extremely powerful tool. Another extremely powerful tool that Arch, and by extension EndeavourOS, has is the Pacman Package Manager. In my opinion, Pacman is the best package manager out there. Pacman has extremely up-to-date packages, sometimes that are built a couple of days or a week prior to when you go to install them. It has a very easy-to-use interface. The graphical tools for Pacman, specifically Pamac and Ball, are very good and easy to use and very beginner-friendly. One of the downsides of Arch, and actually of it being so bleeding edge, is that it tends to not be as stable as other distributions. Now, by that, do I mean that there's actually any problem with Arch, or by extension Endeavour? No. But sometimes if you're installing and updating software, there can be issues because some of the packages are so new and maybe they've updated a version of something that both them and another application depend on that another application you use hasn't, and it might break that other application's functionality. So it's very, kind of wise, common thinking in Arch Linux. I see a lot of people that either never update after they get their system configured, or they update it, once a month, right? They don't update frequently. They don't set on auto updates, nothing like that. They want to know when their system updates, and they usually do it I would say somewhere between very, very frequently and very, very rarely. The third and final distribution I would like to talk about is Fedora. Specifically, this is about Fedora 38, but all Fedora really. Fedora is actually the operating system that I run myself. Being the one that I run myself on a daily basis, I can tell you that there are both some excellent features and some drawbacks of Fedora that you should really consider. In some ways, it's kind of like it's between Debian and Arch in terms of its applications and its packages. Its packages are not quite as up to date as those found in Arch, or by extension in EndeavourOS, but they are much more up to date than those found in Debian. This means that Fedora can be really stable while also having some really neat features that a lot of distributions have not implemented yet, such as support for Wayland, which is a type of interface and desktop environment and all that kind of thing that I'll probably make a video about at some point, that most distributions don't support right now out of the box. It's pretty much like, hey, are you running Fedora? Cool, and you can use some of the really cool Wayland features like Hyperland. If you're not, and you're not running Arch, good luck. However, there are two downsides that are pretty huge that I'd feel remiss not mentioning as someone who uses Fedora daily. The first of these is that Fedora, unlike Arch and Debian, which are solely community driven, has a big influence from Red Hat, which is a huge tech corporation. And while the Fedora project is community built, Red Hat does have some level of say on it. They have a ton of funding for the Fedora project, and the Fedora project even uses some of Red Hat's proprietary code, and that's what its package managers are all based on. A second thing that's kind of frustrating about Fedora is its package manager, DNF. I like DNF. However, out of the box, it is definitively the worst between DNF, apt, and Pacman. It is the worst by far. It's way slower, it's harder to use, it doesn't search as well. It's just a worse package manager, to be honest with you. Now, you can configure DNF, I would say 20-30 seconds is all it takes to make it not as good as Pacman, but in my opinion, anyway, way better than apt. That being said, an end user shouldn't really have to do that. That should be something that the Fedora project just includes in their basic configuration, because by default, DNF is super slow. Like if you go to do your first update before you change the DNF configuration file, it can just take forever. However, if you do that change, it makes it a lot faster. Another thing about DNF that can be kind of confusing for people is Fedora's stance on non-open source software. So most people just think of software as free in terms of cost, right? They think of software like Discord or Steam or Spotify as, hey, those are free because I don't have to pay to download that software. Fedora, on the other hand, thinks of it free as in freedom, right? And what that basically boils down to and means is that if you can't change it or you can't look at it or you can't build it yourself, it's not going to be in DNF by default. It's going to be in some other repository, or it's going to be somewhere where you can add it to DNF, either through Flatpak, which is something we'll talk about in future videos, or through this thing called Copper, which is kind of like the Arch user repository, except for it's just for Fedora and Red Hat projects. So really, those are my gripes with Fedora. It's it's contributed to by Red Hat in a big way, and its package manager by default is the worst of the three. Again, I think it can be better than apt, but not quite as good as Pacman. Pacman is just blazing fast and super easy to use, but it can still be made to be really good. Next, let's talk about how to download these things, right? All of the links to the ISO files, which are the files that you'll put on a flash drive to be able to install Linux, all the links for those will be in the description, and it'll say out to the side, this is for Debian, this is for EndeavourOS, this is for Fedora. You'll then be able to take those files and download them really wherever you want, because eventually you're going to put them on the flash drive, but don't put them on the flash drive immediately. Save it to your desktop, save it to, your documents folder, save it somewhere, but I wouldn't recommend saving it to the flash drive originally, because we're going to burn it to the flash drive. And if you don't know how to do that, that's what we have our next step for. The final thing that we'll need is some sort of tool to flash the operating system onto our flash drives. What I like to use for this is Belina Etcher, although sometimes on Windows I will also use a tool called Rufus. Both of them are very straightforward, but I think that Belina is a little more new user friendly. So if you're not used to flashing ISOs of operating systems, Belina Etcher is definitely the tool for you. We'll just arrive on this page. We'll hit Download Etcher. It'll take us to a link for every operating system we could want, right? There's a portable Windows install, there's a normal install, there's one for Mac OS, there's even downloads for Linux here. After you get Belina Etcher installed and you launch it for the first time, this is what you should see. You can see it breaks it into 3 simple steps. We'll choose a file, we'll select a target. Now, unfortunately, I don't actually have a USB stick plugged into the computer right now, but if I did, that's what I would select for my target. And then we'll just hit flash. Keep in mind that flashing an image onto a USB to make it bootable will erase the contents of that USB. So have them backed up somewhere safe. To get started, we'll click Flash from File. And then I'm going to go to where I have downloaded that ISO and saved it. And I'm just going to use this one here for Debian, kind of because it's small. I would select my target, and this again is where your USB drive should appear. And then you just click Flash. And it's really as simple as that. After you have your flash drive flashed, the next step is to reboot your computer with the flash drive still inserted. It will boot you into the installer for whichever distribution you chose to install, which again I do have guides for Debian, EndeavourOS, and Fedora. The flavor of Fedora that I'll be using is Fedora KDE, although there are multiple different Fedora installations that you could do. And if you need or would like more help kind of getting started and learning how do I set up Steam, how do I get Discord, Spotify, the normal tools that I use, those are in the additional videos that I'll be posting alongside of this of how to install Debian, Endeavour, and Fedora. Lastly, thank you for your time and patience. I hope that you learned something, and I hope you found this video useful. Thank you.